Okay, we are going to talk today about the endocrine system. And I think the first thing that we want to keep in mind is that our body has two control systems. And so one of them is the nervous system. And that's what we talked about last semester. Nervous system being our first type of control system. And nervous system, if you think back about when we talked about the brain and impulses traveling really quickly, that kind of clues you into some of the differences that we have between endocrine and nervous system. So nervous system actions are going to be really quickly. They basically are impulses traveling along nerves that connect structures. It happens within seconds or even milliseconds, very quick responses. And nervous system is going to control processes such as reflexes or innervation to muscles and that sort of thing. If we contrast that with the endocrine system is another type of control system in the body. It's slightly different though, because its effects can be much slower. So it takes time for the processes of the endocrine system to actually happen. And those processes are going to happen through chemical messengers that travel through the bloodstream, and they're released from one endocrine organ, and they travel a distance to have an effect on a distant target organ or target cell. So chemical messengers are called hormones, and that's the way that the endocrine system communicates. So its length of time for response is going to be a lot longer than what we see with the nervous system. And in most cases, the hormones have actions on several different target sites. And so we can see kind of this diffuse response throughout the body. Okay, so just some differences between the two. So when we look at endocrine system, the way that the endocrine system works is that it primarily is going to influence metabolic activity through the use of hormones. And so when we say hormones, hormones are essentially chemical messengers that are going to travel through the bloodstream to have an effect on a target organ, someplace different than where they were released. Okay? There's a lot of different processes in the human body that are regulated by hormones. So I've highlighted some of these here: reproduction, growth of skeletal system, of skeletal muscles, maintenance of electrolyte, balance in the body, water, nutrients, cellular metabolism, and mobilization of your body's defenses are just some examples of processes that the endocrine system is going to play a role in. Okay, so this is something really important here. This is talking about hormone target cell specificity. So what happens is you have an endocrine gland, and it's basically, let's say, here's our endocrine gland here, and it's going to release a hormone that's basically going to enter the bloodstream. Let's say here's our bloodstream, and that hormone is going to be released from the endocrine gland. It's going to move into the bloodstream, and then it's going to start traveling throughout the body. Okay, so we have to have some way for the receptor cells or the target cells to interact with that hormone. That hormone's not going to affect every cell that it comes into contact with. That would be crazy. So it has to have specific cells that it's going to react with. And the way that this happens is through specific protein receptors for that hormone. And so this is how we get this whole concept of specificity. Okay, so the target cell has to have a special receptor for that hormone in order for them to interact. So when we look at these receptors, we find them in one of two locations. They're either going to be on the plasma membrane of the target cell, or they're going to be located inside the target cell. Okay, so we've got two places for them to be. They're either going to be on the plasma membrane on the outside, or they're actually going to be inside the cell. So the hormone has to come inside the cell in order to have an effect. So let's take a look at that. What happens when a hormone affects the target cell? What types of processes does this initiate? So the first thing that can happen is that it can actually change the target cell's plasma membrane permeability or electrical state in terms of like initiating a depolarization or that sort of thing. Once it enters the cell, it can activate synthesis of proteins within the cell. It can either activate or deactivate enzymes. And sometimes we see opposite effects of the same hormone depending on the target cell. Like the same hormone in one target cell could activate an enzyme. In a different target cell, it could actually deactivate an enzyme. So it really depends on the effects of the target cell. And then also hormones can create secretory activities within the cells, within the target cells that they have an effect on. If we look at the overall scheme of hormones, we have two different types of hormones. So one type is going to be water soluble, and we call these amino acid based hormones. So this is basically most hormones. The majority of hormones in our body fall within this category, and they're going to be amino acid based. These typically are water soluble, and as a result, they are not able to cross the plasma membranes of the target cell. Okay, and this is a really important detail here, because if here's my target cell and here's my hormone, I don't know how else to draw it, we'll draw it like a star, it's going to come up. Well, it can't enter this target cell, right? It can't cross the plasma membrane of the target cell. So it's going to have a different way to interact with this cell. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Our second type of hormone is going to be steroid based. And so this type of hormone is synthesized from cholesterol. And as a result, it is lipid soluble. And so it is able to pass right through that plasma membrane of the target cell. So what we see with these guys is maybe here's my target cell here. Here's my hormone floating around in the bloodstream, and it's actually going to be able to cross right through that plasma membrane and enter the target cell and exert its influence that way. Okay, so two different types of hormones, and they need to be able to react with their target cells in two different ways, okay? Because those types of hormones have different functions. So if we look at what happens with amino acid-based hormones, if you recall from what we just talked about, these guys can't cross the plasma membrane of the target cell. So what happens, here's my hormone here, and it's basically been floating along in the bloodstream, and it's going to leave the bloodstream, and here's my target cell here. So what's going to happen with this? Because it's water soluble, it's not able to enter the cell. It can't cross the plasma membrane. So it ends up binding with a receptor located, a protein receptor located in the plasma membrane, embedded in the plasma membrane. And that hormone's going to come along and it's going to bind with that receptor. It's going to activate a structure here. This little blue thing right here, this is kind of a simple version of this. But the big concept here is this blue, this little blue thing here is indicating a G protein. Okay, and so that is going to be activated when the plasma membrane receptor binds to a hormone. It activates a G protein, which is going to in turn change ATP into cyclic AMP. Okay, so ATP is then going to cleave off two adenosine groups and now it's going to become cyclic AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. So only one, or sorry, it's going to cleave off phosphate group. So now it's only got one phosphate group. And this cyclic AMP now becomes our second messenger. Okay, so the hormone itself is our first messenger. And here's our cyclic AMP, which is now inside the cell. It's been activated, and it is now our second messenger. And it's going to have an effect. So it's either going to activate enzymes. It's in some cells, it's going to deactivate enzymes, and those enzymes are going to produce actions within the target cell. Okay, so this is called a second messenger system. And this is what happens when we have amino acid-based hormones that can't enter the cell all on their own. They need to have a backup. They need to have a way of communicating with that cell, and they do that through a second messenger. And in this example, cyclic AMP is the second messenger. Okay? Now, there are other examples of second messenger systems in the body. It's just that cyclic AMP is one of the more common ones, and so I just use that one as an example. Okay? Now, on the flip side of things, some hormones are lipid soluble. So here's our steroid-based hormones, and we know that these guys, because they're steroid-based, they are able to diffuse right through that cell's plasma membrane. So here's our hormone here floating in the bloodstream. It's now going to travel in, and it's able to come right on into that target cell. And actually, it's able to enter the cell's nucleus, and at that point start to have an effect on the gene expression within that cell, within that cell's nucleus. It's going to direct synthesis of specific proteins within that cell that are then going to change that cell's activity. Okay, they're going to create an effect, or in some cases impede an effect because of that. The main point here is that if it is a lipid-soluble hormone, it is able to come right on into that target cell. It enters that cell's nucleus, and it alters the DNA of that cell to drive protein synthesis. Okay. So what controls hormone release in the body? So basically these are negative feedback loops. Okay, so the grand majority, we know that the grand majority of processes in our body occur through negative feedback loops. So that if we have increasing levels of the hormone, what you see is that feedback loop is going to shut off, so that that endocrine organ is told, okay, we've got enough of that hormone, you need to stop producing it. Okay, now if that level of hormone falls, so we basically kind of got this balance here that we've made before. If the level of that hormone falls below normal, then that endocrine organ is stimulated to produce more of that hormone until it gets back up to a normal level. Okay, because our body likes to keep a homeostatic balance of hormones as well, just like everything else in our body. We want to keep it within that narrow range. Now, there are examples of hormones that are positive feedback loops, and I'll point those out because they're not typical. So typically what we see is a negative feedback loop. Okay, and then just kind of this is our last point in terms of general properties of endocrine glands. But basically, endocrine glands need to be told to release their hormone. Okay, so something has to tell them to release it. And there's 3 different ways that endocrine glands can be stimulated to release the hormone that they contain or that they manufacture. So one way is hormonal stimuli. Okay, so basically, if an endocrine gland is stimulated by a hormone coming from another endocrine gland, then it releases its hormone, And that's an example of hormonal stimuli. So the endocrine gland is stimulated by a hormone and it's being told to release its hormones. The second way is humoral stimuli. And so this is what happens when we have endocrine glands that respond to concentration of ions or nutrients in the blood. And I gave you the example of maybe like blood glucose levels or calcium levels in the bloodstream will stimulate an endocrine gland to release its hormone. And then we also have neural stimuli. So basically, if we have nerve fibers that travel to that endocrine gland and stimulate it to release its hormone, that is considered neural stimuli. Okay, so let's talk through some examples of these. So here's 3 examples of the 3 types of stimuli that affect endocrine glands. So here is, let's do hormonal first because that's the first one we talked about. Hormonal. So here's an example of hormonal. We have hypothalamus, which is connected through blood vessels to the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so what's going to happen is the hypothalamus is going to release hormones that travel to the anterior pituitary and tell it to release its hormones. Anterior pituitary hormones are going to travel to a variety of glands, so maybe like thyroid, adrenal cortex, and the gonads, and tell them to release their hormones. Okay, so in this whole cascade of hormone release, we've got various endocrine glands releasing their hormones, telling another endocrine gland to release its hormone. Okay, so that is an example of hormonal stimulus. Humoral stimulus. So remember, this is being caused by levels of nutrients or ions in the bloodstream. And so an example of this is if we have low calcium levels in our blood, that is going to stimulate the parathyroid glands, which are these little tiny glands on the back of your thyroid gland, to release parathyroid hormone. And what parathyroid hormone does is it stimulates bone to be broken down to release its stored calcium. And that's something that we know about, right? Calcium has played a huge role in a lot of processes that we've talked about in the body, especially like muscle contraction. And our body needs a certain amount of calcium in our bloodstream, and we keep that pretty tightly regulated. We also know that the skeletal system is a major storage site for calcium. And so if we break down bone through osteoclastic activity, it's going to release that calcium into our bloodstreams and bring it back up to normal. So in this case, here's humoral stimulus, and it's basically hormone release stimulated by levels of calcium ions in the bloodstream. Okay, and then our third type of stimulus is neural stimulus. And so this is when we have a hormone that's being released as a result of nerve impulses. So in this case, we have nerves traveling from the brain and directly connecting into the adrenal medulla, okay, which are little adrenal glands. They sit on top of the kidneys, and the middle part of them, the kind of interior, is the adrenal medulla, and it has a connection to the brain, and those nerves will stimulate adrenal medulla to release its hormones. And so that's an example of neural stimuli. Okay, here's some examples of major endocrine glands in the body. And what I've done is I've kind of pulled out some of the major ones that we're going to talk about. Okay, another thing to note too, this is kind of interesting, is that endocrine glands are located, all throughout the body. They're located in very diverse areas. So this is one of the organ systems that's really spread out throughout the body. So here's our first one, major endocrine gland. This is posterior pituitary. And so if you remember, where's posterior pituitary? Here it is right here. Remember, it's basically like hanging down from the brain, and it's sitting in that sella turcica, that little Turkish saddle, so perfectly like right in the center of the brain. So pituitary gland is technically divided up into two different glands. So we've got anterior pituitary, and then we've got posterior pituitary. Okay, and so posterior pituitary actually has a neural connection to the hypothalamus. Okay, so you've got nerves that connect, neurons that connect the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. So the two hormones that we're going to talk about here are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And so these hormones are actually produced by the hypothalamus, and then they travel along the neuron, and they are stimulated to be released by the hypothalamus. So posterior pituitary doesn't actually make these hormones. It just kind of stores them until hypothalamus tells it to release them. So first one is oxytocin. This is an example of an amino acid-based hormone. So right there, that should tell you, how does this hormone interact with its target cells, right? It's amino acid based, so it can't enter that target cell by itself. It has to use a second messenger system. Okay, release of oxytocin is triggered by the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus tells posterior pituitary to release oxytocin when needed. And we see oxytocin, its effects are to stimulate smooth muscle, uterine contractions during childbirth. And then also, if you're a new mother and you're nursing, it's going to stimulate ejection of milk, otherwise known as the letdown reflex in new mothers. Okay? One of the changes that we see here is an increase in the number of oxytocin receptors in the uterus at the end of pregnancy. And so this helps kind of facilitate oxytocin's effect during childbirth. This is one of the less common examples of a positive feedback loop. And so what happens here is that when we have contraction of the smooth muscle in the uterus during childbirth, it's basically pushing the baby down into the cervix, which is right at the opening of the uterus. Okay? What happens there is that nerve impulses from the cervix are going to travel up to the brain to basically tell the brain, okay, we are in childbirth, and we're going to stimulate release of oxytocin. So the pituitary gland is going to release more oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to travel through the bloodstream down to the uterus, okay? And oxytocin stimulates stronger and stronger uterine contractions. So the uterus is going to contract stronger. That's going to push the baby's head against the cervix even more and cause even more release of oxytocin. So this is one of the examples of a positive feedback loop. When does this shut off? Well, after the baby's born, there's no more pressure against the cervix, and the whole cycle can shut off at that point. So this is an example of positive feedback. Okay, our second hormone from the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone. Okay, this is another example of an amino acid-based hormone. So again, think in your mind, like, okay, how is this hormone going to interact with its target cells because it's amino acid-based? If we think about the name, let's talk about the function of ADH. If we have a diuretic, the definition of a diuretic is to increase urine formation. Okay? This is an antidiuretic. So it's the opposite. So ADH is actually going to inhibit urine formation. Okay? So it's going to decrease the amount of urine that your body generates. How does this happen? So if you are dehydrated, this is the primary reason why we see release of ADH. If you are dehydrated, this is significantly dehydrated, like you've been out in the desert for like 3 days, your body is going to release antidiuretic hormone. Okay? That's going to tell your kidneys to reabsorb more water back into the bloodstream to keep water, to conserve water. This is going to result in a decreased volume of urine. And then, as a result, we're going to have a decreased concentration of solutes in the bloodstream because we are adding more water to them. Okay, so primary reason that you see this is in conditions of dehydration, we have increased release of ADH. Okay, this brings me to my next point. Look what we have here. We have an inverse relationship between urine volume and blood volume, right? So if we decrease urine volume, okay, we are going to reabsorb more water, and that makes our blood volume increase. So we're going to ultimately end up having increased blood volume. Okay. A couple other, conditions where we see ADH playing a role. I thought this was interesting. Alcohol actually inhibits the secretion of ADH. So alcohol decreases ADH secretion, so we're going to end up seeing an increased volume of urine when you drink alcohol, which is why if you drink alcohol, you may notice that you have to pee a lot, okay? So if you have increased urine output, your body is losing all that water, it's going to ultimately, result in dehydration, which is why if you go out at night and let's say that you drink too much alcohol, the next morning, like you're dying of thirst. And that's because you've had this increased volume of urine and now you're dehydrated. And then if you work in a clinical setting, you may have noticed that you have some patients who take diuretics. So maybe they have congestive heart failure or their body tends to retain a lot of fluid. Well, they will take diuretics which will basically increase urine volume because they're trying to get rid of that excess fluid. So if your patients are taking diuretics, they are basically working against ADH. They will impede the effects of ADH, which will basically take water from the body. You're going to pee it out in your urine in order to decrease edema or excess fluid in your body. Okay. Okay. And then next one, we had posterior pituitary. Now we're going to talk about anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is a little different. It's technically like a whole different organ from posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus through bloodstream. Okay, so hypothalamus is going to release hormones that are going to travel through the blood to the anterior pituitary and tell it to release its hormones. Okay, so it's connected. It's technically a portal system, and if you think about the portal system in the liver, it's the same kind of setup. We've got blood vessels that are connecting these two structures. So anterior pituitary is going to release all of these different hormones. The one that we are going to focus on is going to be growth hormone. Okay, growth hormone is what's considered to be an anabolic hormone. And that basically means that in all of the things that it does, it stimulates growth and building up of structures. Okay, so it is considered anabolic. In all of these functions, that's basically what it's doing. So what's happening? It's going to mobilize fat so that you can use it for energy. It's going to break down glycogen in the liver are stored glucose so that we can release glucose into the bloodstream to use for energy. It's going to decrease the rate of glucose uptake by cells so that more glucose stays in the bloodstream and is available for usage. It causes our cells to take up amino acids, which are building blocks of proteins, to be used for growth. And it's going to stimulate the growth of our long bones and also skeletal muscle mass in our body, which is why you'll hear bodybuilders, I guess, taking growth hormone to help build up skeletal muscle mass. Or even older people. It's not just bodybuilders, even older people. What we see with growth hormone release is that it's secreted at a greater concentration at night when you sleep, and it's primarily released in adolescence. It kind of peaks when you're in your teenage years, even late teenage, early 20s, and then at that point, it's actually going to fall off, and its release declines as you age. We do have a couple examples of pathology. I am trying to point out some pathology with the endocrine system because it's so interesting when we have pathology, and endocrine pathology is very interesting. So two things happen with growth hormone. Number one, you can have a hypersecretion, which means that your secretion is increased, right? Hyper. And so usually what happens here is that this may be due to a tumor, like a pituitary tumor. And hypersecretion, you see it in two different ways. Number one, you can see gigantism, which is basically where you have long bone growth. Like it grows a lot more than would be typical. And so if you have a child that is secreting increased levels of growth hormone, you see their long bones grow really, really long. So these people will be very tall, but their proportions are normal because all of their long bones grew too much. On the other side of it, we can have a condition called acromegaly. And what happens with this is that if you end up having hypersecretion of growth hormone after your growth plates have closed. So if you think about, our long bones, and we've got the little epiphyseal plates at the ends of them, if those epiphyseal plates have closed up and you're not able to have long bone growth and length anymore, those bones will just get thicker. Okay? So that's what we see with acromegaly. You basically see the bones get really thick. They don't grow any longer. They just get thicker. And so that looks like this. Here's an example of gigantism. So we've got this guy here on the right, and he's very, very tall. He's got very long bones, but his proportions look, pretty normal. In this picture, I've got some examples of a patient with acromegaly. So you typically see increased thickness through the frontal bone. You see increased thickness through the chin. Their hands will be very large and very thick bones too. But this is what this is how patients who have acromegaly will look, with really thick bones. And then in the case of hyposecretion, which means that growth hormone is decreased, what we see is a condition called pituitary dwarfism. And so what happens with this is that this patient doesn't release enough growth hormone, so their long bone growth is really stunted and decreased. And that's what we see with the person here. On the left, they basically have pituitary dwarfism. And so what'll happen with these patients is with kids, they'll track their growth over time. And if they're not meeting, the typical growth curve for their age, they would do some lab tests where they would measure growth hormone levels. And if they're lower than normal, they could give them synthetic growth hormone to stimulate long bone growth. So that I don't feel like pituitary dwarfism is nearly as common now because we have medication to counteract that. Okay, our next major endocrine gland is our thyroid. And thyroid is located on the front of your neck. So if you find hyoid bone here and you come just down from that, we've got our thyroid cartilage, and then just distal to that is going to be our thyroid gland here, right on the anterior part of our neck. Thyroid hormone is really important because it basically has an effect on just about every cell in the body. So thyroid hormone is important with increasing metabolic rate, metabolism. It helps to increase body heat production. It plays a role in tissue growth and development. And then it also plays a role in our blood pressure. So it has vast effects on our body. Thyroid hormone basically is comprised of two other separate hormones, and they are called T3 and T4. So triiodothyronine and then thyroxine. So we've got two hormones, T3 and T4, that combine to make thyroid hormone. Okay, so how does thyroid, here's our thyroid gland here, and what you can see is this whole kind of cascade of releasing. So how does thyroid gland know to release its hormone? Basically, hypothalamus tells it to. So hypothalamus in the brain is going to release a thyroid releasing hormone that's going to tell the anterior pituitary to release its thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to tell thyroid gland to release its thyroid hormone. Okay? And so if you think about this, think just for a second, we had three types of stimuli that prompted endocrine glands to release their hormones. So we had neural, and we had humoral, and we had hormonal. So thyroid gland is stimulated by what type of stimulus in this scenario? This would be an example of hormonal stimuli, right? Because here's our hormone here, and I've spelled it out for you here. So thyroid gland is being stimulated by a hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary. So this would be an example of a hormonal stimuli. Okay. Thyroid hormone is kind of interesting because it requires iodine, which is basically converted to iodine in order to synthesize functional hormones. Okay, so we need iodine in our diet, which is why if you go to your kitchen and you pull out salt, odds are your salt is going to say, this salt has iodine added to it. So what we do in our country is we add iodine to food that we use a lot, like salt, so that we get iodine in our diet in order to synthesize thyroid hormone. There are some cases where this doesn't happen, and so some pathology related to the thyroid gland. One example of this is called myxedema, and this is basically hypothyroidism. So this is low thyroid hormone. And what happens with this is that we can either have a lack of iodine. So if you don't get enough iodine in your body, your thyroid hormone is not going to make functional thyroid hormone. Or we can have a lack of thyroid stimulating hormone. So maybe the thyroid gland isn't being stimulated to produce the thyroid hormone. If you've had your thyroid gland removed, so maybe a patient has thyroid cancer and they have their thyroid removed, in all of these cases, you're going to have decreased thyroid hormone. So what happens? What types of symptoms do these patients present with? Well, they're tired all the time because their metabolism is so low. They are going to have a decrease in their metabolic rate, which means that in a lot of cases, they're going to gain weight. They have dry skin, really puffy eyes. They tend to retain water. So those are all symptoms of hypothyroidism. Okay. Another pathology related to thyroid is the formation of a goiter. And so this is what happens. Look at this. This is called a goiter right here. And so this is basically an enlarged thyroid gland. So you'll see it on patients in the front of their neck. Again, we don't see this that much in our country because we supplement our diet with iodine, but you sometimes see it in other countries. So if iodine is lacking in the diet, basically what happens is your thyroid gland gets really, really big because it's being stimulated to produce the hormone, but the hormone it's producing isn't being used because it doesn't contain iodine. But hypothalamus and pituitary are saying, hey, we need this hormone. You need to keep producing it. So the thyroid hormone gets overstimulated and gets larger and larger. It's trying to keep up with demand, but it can't produce good hormones because you don't have iodine in your diet. And then our third pathology related to thyroid hormone is called Graves' disease. And this is basically like a hyperthyroidism. This is an autoimmune disease where your own body makes antibodies against your thyroid follicular cells. And the follicular cells are the cells that produce thyroid hormone. So those cells end up being overstimulated and we have increased production of thyroid hormone. So these guys have, much higher amounts of thyroid hormone. And so if you think back about what the effects of thyroid hormone were, we're going to have increased metabolic rate, which means their metabolism is just through the roof. So these patients typically will see weight loss. We end up seeing these kind of bulging eyes like this on these patients. And basically what happens with that is our body, we have fat behind our eyeballs, and our body lays down extra fat behind our eyeballs and pushes our eyeballs forward. It's called exophthalmos, and it creates like this bulging eyeball look. And then these patients tend to be really nervous, and it's basically due to changes in their metabolism. But these are very, very thin people because of that increased level of thyroid hormone.